Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kernahan Webb. I am a professor in Toronto Metropolitan University in the Law Business Department, and I'm also, and more importantly, for current purposes, the director of the Toronto Metropolitan University Institute for the Study of Corporate Social Responsibility. And it's my pleasure to welcome back for a return engagement Aimee Boulanger from IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It is a return engagement because a lot has happened since the last time we chatted in 2020. That's one reason. The second reason is because really IRMA represents, I was just saying this to Aimee, represents one of the most sophisticated and advanced non-state approaches to regulation of any sector, but we're looking at it specifically here in the context of the extractive sector. So there's a lot to look at. There's a lot to discuss, and I'm really looking forward to it. Just to mention as well, all of these sessions are developed in the spirit of constructive engagement, or really just how can we learn, and in particular, how can we optimize the benefits of the mining of the private sector participating in the economy and society, environmental, social, and economic, and minimize the negative impacts. That's really kind of the focal point of everything that we do. Next slide, please. Toronto is located in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Next slide, please. All CSR Institute sessions are animated by this definition of social responsibility, which comes from a international standard, ISO 26000. The actual standard is more than 100 pages long, but we've extracted out this definition for CSR Institute purposes because it was hammered out among 300 plus participants from developed and developing countries through a consensus process. We'll be talking about consensus processes, Aimee, momentarily. And it is, as far as we know, the best and most comprehensive definition out there of social responsibility. Just to note that it's about transparency, it's about ethics, it's about sustainable development. It's not limited to the environment. It's also health and the welfare of society. It's not just about shareholders. It's taking into account expectations of all impacted stakeholders. It is about compliance with the law, but it's not just about compliance with the law. It's also significant international norms of behavior. And again, we really see that in spades with the IRMA initiative, how many of these are underlying everything that IRMA does. And it's not just about how it's practiced within any particular organization. It's also how it's practiced in all of its relationships with communities, with workers, with consumers, with governments, and so on. And again, IRMA is really just an extremely good example of how all of that is lived on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. The second animating concept for everything that we do here at the CSR Institute is the concept of sustainable governance, which basically says that to address the sorts of issues that we face in the 21st century, environmental, social, and economic, fast evolving, oftentimes technology driven, the only way we can effectively address them is through a combination of government, private sector, and civil society action. Each of government, private sector, and civil society has unique capacities, but also unique limitations. So when we use all of them, and all of them have got the capability to develop rule instruments, processes, institutions, and unique sets of actors around them, Sometimes it's all about cooperation and collaboration. Sometimes it's more about a rivalrous competitive dynamic. But when you draw on all of them and you draw on all of them systematically, that gives us the greatest likelihood of what we call here sustainable governance. Next slide, please. And so in that sustainable governance concept is this taxonomy of institutions, rule instruments, processes, and actors. In the instruments category, in the government side of things, yes, it's laws and related guidelines and so on that government comes up with, but it's also things like ISO standards or the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or the IRMA. Well, actually, now there's several different IRMA standards instruments that they use and so on. And then industry all by themselves have their own unique instruments, such as the Mining Association of Canada's various different instruments associated with their TSM towards Sustainable Mining Initiative, and all kinds of processes, rulemaking processes, rule implementation processes, dispute resolution processes. Again, you've got the government ones that everybody's familiar with, the courts, Parliament, and or Congress, and the regulatory agencies. But there's kind of equivalents of all of those in the private sector and in civil society as well. And then there's a huge set of interacting actors, and they all come together, particularly in the most effective contexts. You have all of them, and they're all kind of fighting for air in the same spot. And the more that there are, the more complicated the situation is, but also the greater likelihood that if any one of them drops the ball for whatever reason, there'll be another entity, instrument, institution, or process that will be able to step in, perhaps not in exactly the same way that the initial instrument, institution, process, or actor did, but in some way. And that's why we call it sustainable governance, because it's capable of rolling with the punches and evolving as circumstances arise. And certainly we're going to see all of that when we talk momentarily with Aimee about IRMA. Next slide, please. So we have CSR Institute talks all the time. If this is your first time here, welcome. If this is return engagement, welcome back. Actually, just in the past hour, I had confirmation of one coming up at the end of the month on July 28th, and that is with a small and medium-sized family-owned company, and just a talk with her. She's the CEO of Armor Plate, a small, medium-sized firm here in Canada, and how they navigate their way through the very challenging economic, social, and environmental environment. And because it's a family-owned business, then there's also that there's an intergenerational element that's very interesting. So stay tuned for that. We'll be putting up more information about that one coming up in the next while. But all of the previous sessions and this one that we're having now are all recorded and then posted up on our website. So you can always find them there, and they are accessible by anyone and everyone. So there's a lot of other stuff going on here at TMU, and that's just mentioned here in this slide. Next slide, please. So when we talk about things like IRMA, IRMA is an initiative, but it's useful to distinguish initiatives from coalitions and movements. IRMA definitely is an initiative, but I think probably Aimee would say, and we'll be turning things over to her in a second, don't worry, that it probably started off as a coalition. That is to say, just a grouping of people coming together around a particular idea, saying, I think there's something we can do about this. And then it becomes more formalized, and at that point it becomes an initiative. And then you have movements, and movements are kind of even broader and even more organic and less organized oftentimes. So you can have an anti-war movement, that sort of thing. But again, from movements can come coalitions, and initiatives, as the case might be. So they're all tending to be interrelated. The reason why I specifically wanted to bring that up here is because a topic that has gripped me and many other people at this moment is what we do with our neighbor to the south, and the destructive impact it is having on the international rules-based order, and obviously the havoc it's producing within the United States as well, but at the international level. And so I've been exploring with others the idea of there being a global multi-stakeholder coalition in support of the rule of law. But I've been amazed and surprised and disappointed at how difficult it is to get that up and running. I would think it's kind of a slam dunk. So, Aimee, we'll be talking about that as well. I'm just kind of interested to hear your thoughts about that as a veteran who has moved something all the way through from an idea through now a full-fledged initiative. So we will turn to that as a kind of a more broad topic at some point in the discussion now. Next slide, please. So IRMA has been around since 2012, but the gestation period in terms of pilots and so on, it took quite a while because I would suggest they wanted to do it right, and that took a lot of time. So we're going to see how that all worked out, but it is a bringing together of civil society, of different um, uh, private sector sides of things. The mining sector, yes, but also the downstream buyers of mining products and investors. So three different categories of industry, and then obviously within civil society, you've got directly affected communities, but you've also got workers and so on. So it's a fascinating bringing together and mobilization in a very instrumental way of that to deal with the issue of responsible mining. It has the standard for responsible mining, but now there's a number of other standards that I'm sure Aimee's going to be talking about. And so as you can see here, born from a collaborative multi-stakeholder effort to define more responsible mining practices, it's continued to be refined. And again, that's one of the reasons why I was really looking forward to talking to Aimee again, is because so much has happened from the excellent discussion that we had back in 2020 when really there was just pilots that were being worked out. And now things are actually up and running. So really looking forward to seeing how that all goes. So next slide, please. About Aimee. She is indeed a widely respected leader in this area. Been at it for a long time. And she's been working very closely with all of the aforementioned parties and constantly refining and improving the processes within IRMA. And prior to that, she was the coordinator and leader within IRMA standards development process. And she was with, were you not with Earthworks? Yes, you were with Earthworks.
I was
That's not
usually.
mentioned here, but Earthworks played an absolutely critical
They
role
did.
in starting this whole thing up. So
They
again, we'll
did.
be turning to Aimee for that full story in a second here. But it's a very interesting combination of two unlikely partners, a business partner and an NGO, which was oftentimes up until that point more playing the role of being a critic, but stepped forward and did something very neat. So all very interesting. And you can see there, going right back to Aimee's educational experience way back in environmental studies at Mount Holyoke College. I don't even know where that is. Where is that?
It's in Massachusetts on this southern side of the border that is creating troubles right now for you. So we'll have to dive deeper into all that. We'll hold accountability down here as well as we do. So
Good, good. Glad to hear that.
mhm.
Okay, so final slide, and that is just to say, welcome to everybody. We have people patching in from everywhere, from Australia, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from Europe. Welcome everybody, and obviously from people in United States and Canada and so on as well. But the last time we did this back in 2020, there were some really excellent questions that came in that I was able to fold into the discussion, and I'm fully anticipating that'll be the case this time around. So just remember what you need to do is just email me. I'm checking my emails constantly, and I will do my best to fold in those thoughts. So finally, over to you, um, uh, Aimee, and uh, again, my thanks for you doing a repeat performance. And I think, in fairness to our listeners who come from across the board. Some of them will be mining companies, very, very familiar with what you're doing, and NGOs and governments and so on that are very, very familiar with everything that you're doing now. But some are not so familiar. For example, coming in from the apparel sector, not really familiar with what's going on over in the extractive sector, or just an academic or a student coming in that doesn't have a lot of experience. So what that means is that we're going to be having to dip back and do some rewinding of the tape, as well as now things that are going on now. So maybe we can start off by, can you just give us a quick sketching of how did this thing come about from unlikely beginnings?
Okay. So thank you, first of all, Professor Webb, for having me back again. Thank you so much. I'm glad that we're still in this conversation 6 years later now, and a lot has changed in that time. But so yes, I will say that so from the biggest level, I mean, things that come from mining, we use them every day. So even if we may not understand how those materials are sourced, or those who know may be deeply concerned about the impacts of industrial scale extraction and how that happens, we are complicit. The vast majority of us, especially those of us sitting in wealthy nations, these materials are in our cars, our phones, our computers, they're in buildings, in jewelry, technology, and now increasingly they are going to energy sources that can produce renewable energy cleaner than burning fossil fuels. So they're in our infrastructure of wind turbines, solar panels, and then the battery storage for them, including electric vehicles. And so, but taking you back, as you said, 20 years ago, this conversation about where does your stuff come from had already happened for food, agriculture. People were talking about coffee and cocoa, know where your water comes from, know where your electricity comes from. The logging industry was in the news. And mining was later to this conversation. You mentioned the garment sector earlier. Why was mining later than garments or coffee, cocoa, and the others? Part of it is because it changes so much along the way, right? My phone looks really different than the mines that may have produced the materials from dozens of different countries that go into it. Whereas when you walk into the store, the banana looks like the banana that left the plantation that's there. It's easier for our brains and our supply chains to make that connection and understand where it was sourced. But it's a lot harder for us as end consumers to understand and to feel that leverage and reach and contact. But 20 years ago now, I came into IRMA in 2012, but in 2006, so a full 20 years ago now, was when the first people sat down to have this conversation. And the origin point was you had Tiffany and Company, the jewelers, reaching out to Earthworks, the NGO, as you said, saying, look, we make these products that with the intention that they be beautiful, that they be symbolic of beautiful connections between people. We don't want to be associated with harm to children in Africa or other places around the world. And yet we don't run mines. We don't even buy directly from mines. How can we even leverage our responsible sourcing purchasing power to change the way mining's done? We're turning to you, Earthworks, and other NGOs to tell us who are the responsible producers. And for the NGOs like Earthworks or Mining Watch Canada or others who have been focused on the mining industry for decades, um, they're small, even as they may be powerful in raising these issues up. But they said, look, we have not had the luxury to look at who is best. We've been trying to stop some of the worst practices. And so it opened a conversation around what would best practices look like in mining and could we craft incentive for that? And that was really the beginning part of what IRMA could be is like, can we talk about what could responsible mining look like? Could it be a definition that's trusted by diverse people around the world? Would there be a way to measure it that was trusted, that wasn't feared as greenwashing or cheating? And could we then create more value for it to be done better? Can we change the way this industry is done and create? And there was a lot of skepticism, including me, at that time, but it really grew out of there.
Couple of points.
Mhm.
One, you said we're all complicit. I just,
Mhm.
um, as a legally trained guy, just like there's a difference between intentionality or even awareness and complete lack of awareness. I would say probably most of us, not me, not you, fall into the category of just complete lack of awareness, maybe
Mhm.
even willful lack of awareness, but lack of awareness in the sense of I just want the best phone. That's all I'm interested in. Don't bother me with anything else, right? So I would say we're all complicit at the level of, at the end of the day, we're all using these products, and these products all have got various different implications, but uh, not complicit in the sense of some sort of intention to do harm,
Mhm.
including really large numbers of people within the mining sector. They don't feel as if they're doing something harmful. They
Mhm.
think they're doing something good, and in many ways they are. You know, it's jobs, it's royalties, it's revenue, and so on, and it's getting people out of the ladder of incredible poverty, but definitely. At the mine site level, particularly if there's indigenous communities around, that's highly, highly disruptive of their entire way of living. And in terms of the implications of those products long term on the environment and so on, yeah,
Mhm.
hugely,
Mhm.
hugely problematic. And obviously, we're struggling with addressing all those issues. Point number one. Point number two, in terms of the jewelers connecting with an NGO, it was really a critical stepping across the aisle by both parties that had to involve a certain amount of, holding our breath and trusting that we can build something there. The other thing, though, is that the jeweler sector and other retail sectors that have pushed the producers to do things, Home Depot, for example, with respect to paper and Forest Stewardship Council and similar initiatives like that, or even clothing, apparel companies, one or another, they're really not getting all that much pressure from individual consumers. But I think what they're doing is they're acting as proxy blocks of potentially could be awakened consumers. And what we're going to do is we're going to get ahead of the curve and attempt to address those issues now before it turns into a viral campaign on us. So I honestly think that most people getting a nice diamond or getting a phone or whatever, they really don't care. But if there is a viral campaign against Apple or against Tiffany's or against whatever, at that point they do care. And so what they'd like to do is get ahead of the curve by saying, we're working to address all of these issues. And you don't have to believe me over here in industry. Uh, may I introduce to you these partners that I have who are earthworks over here and, et cetera, around the table. And they are working with us to attempt to address that. So I think it's a very cool, if I could use a very non-academic word. It's a very cool thing when there are these reaches across the aisle. And I think it's really gets into something really interesting, which is as a result of the internet, there's an ability for civil society, which up until then was at an incredible disadvantage compared with industry and government. Um, Now, through the internet and social media and beyond that, suddenly civil society had the ability to organize, to disseminate, and so on, almost in a way that business and government always had. And I think that really elevated things. At that moment, things like the FSC became possible. The Forest Stewardship Council became possible. Talking about that
Mm,
in the area of wood. So I just wanted to kind of dig down on those 2 points because I think they are important. But I also want to, before you go on in the story, I want to just kind of hear your reaction to those 2 points. It's kind of
mm,
pushing you back into
mm.
things that you don't have to think about anymore because you're
Oh,
so much further
goodness.
along. But
No.
when you do think about them, I'm interested to hear your
Hmm.
thoughts on that.
I mean, I actually think I love that you took this to a scholarly and philosophical perspective because I feel like I do think about those things each day because we're still asking ourselves, how do we create value for this industry to change? And how do we create value for the industry to evolve and innovate to being seeing itself as an industry that's about the materials we use, not just new extraction, but as increasingly we look at opportunities for circular economy, right? We're not going to just grow more lithium. We're not going to grow
Yeah.
more iron ore the way that we can in the coffee, cocoa, other sectors that I mentioned. We need to really look at how do we do this differently and reuse these materials. But going back to your point on intention, I mean, I actually want to agree with you and put a highlighter pen on that and say, even if we could be more intentional on the materials we're using every day, not only is it exhausting amidst your daily life, and I bet many listeners think about it each time, even if they pull out a plastic bag and they're like,
Yeah.
ugh,
Feel
right? I
bad about
know
it. Yeah.
this, right? I know this. I know I'm not supposed to be using this. And I've got to hurry because I'm putting my kids, sandwiches in this bag and I got to head off to this field trip, but it's already 15 minutes late. It's like we're not going to be, for many of us, either wealthy enough, nor educated enough, nor powerful enough to solve these problems alone. And yet a lot of the weight of it comes back to the individual consumer. You should buy responsibly. You should make these decisions, right? Yeah, you give up your plastics for a year. I love that idea. And what we need is a wholesale, these need full society policies to shift them that support, whether it's the individual consumer or the individual mine worker, to be able to enable. We need a whole set of systems that create value for this to be done differently. And that was part of Irma's thought was to can we, rather than just go telling the person who's going to go buy the ring from the jeweler, can we say, okay, we're going to go all the way back up into how we source these materials and agree on what would be a way that everyone agreed? And I'll come back to the idea of who is everyone there, but can we agree on what is the definition of more responsible mining? Can we agree a way to measure it? And then can we create value for companies to do it? Because right now, as long as they're competing with others who may not choose to do it, are we creating a differentiation between those who reduce harm and many companies have been looking for this, right? We have had many wonderful graduates come out of a whole range of different programs and step into the mining industry, interested to work outdoors, interested to provide materials we do use each day and feel like they're essential in that work. Can we support them in that? And they don't want to see themselves in conflict with the communities they most often live in themselves in terms of what about clean water? What about indigenous rights? What about the cultural heritage or biodiversity around this mine site? So that was the idea is could we create a shared definition and then value to meet that?
Well, which is an enormous task to get those people around the table who come from those perspectives and, as they say these days, lived experience with those
Mm,
perspectives, and not really having to live with everyone else's perspective the way you do around a table with six different sets of, carefully define, now it's six at any rate within IRMA,
Mhm.
define interests, sitting around the table and trying to find common ground on that. So that's a huge challenge. But it has occurred to me that in this area as well, what we're seeing is almost the construction of government without government, right?
Mm,
We look to government to be representing the public interest. And that is an incredibly hard job because representing the public interest means representing the economy and all of the drivers of the economy, but also representing all of those who are affected negatively and positively by that. And somehow or other, we lump that all into a vote every 4.5 or 5 years
that's true.
for a particular party, and you sort it out, right?
Right.
And what I see with something like Irma is let's deconstruct what government is. It is all of those interests. So let's deconstruct them and then let's reconstruct them around a table, around a particular issue, and let's see what we can do. It's sort of government in miniature. And,
Hmm.
I think we can come back to the fact that government is not directly involved
Hmm.
in Irma's work. They're indirectly involved because there's a lot of intergovernmental international standards and laws and so on that were produced by governments, but they're not so directly involved. And so that's why it really is kind of like a reconstruction of the stakeholders of society to form a government of a sort, an international government of a sort that regulates everywhere, not just in any one country. So anyway,
I mean,
next.
that's well said because I mean, the power of laws and government is that you have a rule which has legal consequence, right? And it's a rule that was agreeable enough that if you had a fairly democratically elected government, which are these things are not givens, right? I'm saying a
No.
whole bunch of things that are filled with caveats right now,
Yeah.
especially right now. But in theory, they set rules that society agreed these are things we should have clean water, we should have clean air, you should be safe when you go to work. We should have an equity across genders and the people who are at work, and a sense that people are respected while they're there. So that was the idea, and it had a legal consequence behind it. And so I will say a voluntary initiative like IRMA is never going to be able, nor should it, compete or replace with the rule of law. But the more that we can move more quickly to create political comfort with the idea that more responsible mining is possible, that it's actually more economically viable than the way we've done things in the past, that the industry is rising to this moment, that it's becoming a status quo, that communities and the private sector are asking for the same thing of the mining industry, and the mining industry is able to rise to that opportunity, the more we're going to give governments a permission slip, if you will, to say, look, we can raise our expectations, and we can meet instead of just looking at the mining industry as a source of tax funds that come in for everything else government does, healthcare and education and feeding people and housing people, it becomes a value in itself because it creates the prosperity of meaningful jobs. So in 2006, when that challenge was initially created and opportunity between jewelry and NGOs, they knew it couldn't be a bilateral conversation. We're not going to get anywhere with just two, especially if we have a company who doesn't just want to have their own boutique sourcing, which they didn't. They said, let's see if we can create a sea change in this industry. They created the table that you've spoken to there, Professor Webb. They have six houses who are at the table. These are my bosses. Each of these six houses have two seats each at this table, and they strive to create decisions by consensus. They can vote, but if the two seats in any one of these houses, so if two seats from affected communities vote no on something, it stops because they're committed to not leaving a house behind. So two no votes from the same house are a veto, and then they need to sit back down. And they rarely get to that point because really just one person will lean forward and say, I'm not sure if we can. I think I need to check in with, I'm not, will this really work for? And so they're very much always in conversation with one another, trying to get to a place where, all of them can create a system where they feel that they can create a shared vision of a world where mining industry would respect those aspirations of affected communities, provide safe workplaces, and minimize harm to the environment. And you mentioned earlier, I think I have a slide here too. I'm going to hop ahead to it, but you said something specifically about Indigenous communities, in a time when we're talking about materials to go to energy transition, although over the last year and a half, we're talking a lot more about national security than energy transition, and national self-sufficiency than we are energy transition. But still, all of these things, these materials under these various categories, it's estimated that half of these will come from indigenous lands right now, what are officially considered and recognized as indigenous lands. So we have what is potentially a real conflict, but it's also an opportunity moment to solve what has been an integrated problem for more than 500 years, which is that these materials being extracted by some and used disproportionately by some are coming from others who either weren't using them and or were using them in a very different way at a different scale and feel that the extraction is disproportionately harming them. Instead of those being two separated problems right now, they must be addressed together. Now, we will not separate them, but that also gives us the unbelievable opportunity right now to solve and address what it means to have extraction on Indigenous lands and what it means to create value for more responsible mining for all who live near where mining happens. And what can that look like? I'll
Well
pause there.
said. Yeah, the other thing is I think one could say that IRMA is modeling what is possible,
Mm,
right? You have all kinds of naysayers, and we need skeptics. I'm skeptical
mm,
until you kind of prove to me something or other, and I think that's not a bad way to be. But there's a lot of skepticism about the ability to do something like mine in a sustainable way. How can you possibly do that? How can you possibly ensure that indigenous populations are comfortable and happy and are in for it, along with customers? We're a completely different situation.
mhm,
Or workers or mining companies or investors or what have you. So this models that this can be done. It's not that it's easy, but it models that it can be done. The second thing I wanted to mention is that law. Yes, this is not government. Yes, this is not the state. Uh, and this is not law.
mhm,
However, every aspect of IRMA is constructed through law. There are
mm.
contracts everywhere you look that
That's interesting.
connect each part with every other part. Any company that's getting certified, I think there might be another word they're using instead of certification, but I'm going to just use it as a shorthand here. That's getting certified by IRMA. That's a contract, so they cannot use the logo or claim this or that unless they are doing this and that, and it'll be withdrawn if they don't. So that's a contract. There's a contract with the auditor. There's contracts everywhere you look. And there's law everywhere you look. There's IP, there's intellectual property for the logo and so on. So there's law there. And then on top of that, if a company is accused, and perhaps with good reason, of engaging in environmental or human rights or worker or other harm, there's a good possibility that the fact, if they are IRMA certified, they will be bringing that up. And that could be what in Canada we call a due diligence defense.
Mm,
So in that way, the courts can see whether or not this constitutes reasonable behavior by that mining company to attempt to work through IRMA to resolve that problem. Whether or not that becomes an exculpation of liability is another matter. But so there's a strong connection there between the state and IRMA. And then finally,
mm,
and you can please expand on this, um, people benchmark IRMA against a regulatory regime in order to see which are in any way deficient, right? So maybe that will reveal that IRMA is deficient in this way and that way, in which case, then IRMA people say, you say,
mhm,
well, we need to address that. Or maybe it will show, as it has, for example, with respect to Ontario, where there was a sort of a comparison done of IRMA
Mm-hmm.
with the regulatory regime of Ontario in 2020. So I don't know what the situation is now,
Mm-hmm.
but that revealed weaknesses in terms of what the government of Ontario had done.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know that IRMA has been used as part of support for how this or that law in this or that jurisdiction could be revised or improved, drawing on IRMA's experience with this and that. So there's a heck of a lot of connections, legal connections between IRMA, a voluntary initiative, and the law, even though it
Mm-hmm.
most assuredly
Mm-hmm.
is not a law, cannot be imposed on anyone, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore that's a significant understood limitation of this or any voluntary initiative when compared with a conventional command and control regulatory law. But the fact of the matter is, they work together extremely well. There's a lot of synergies between the two, and a lot of potential um, good ways of illustrating where there are limitations in
Mm-hmm.
each of them, and hence can be improved.
I'm going to pick up on several great threads you had there, so that really braid together well. So one is I put up here because you mentioned the customers of mining and about how even where you don't have law, you can have contracts and other ways to bind expectations for responsible practices. And so IRMA has, amidst its six houses there, not just the board of directors, but members um, behind each of those different houses. And in those who are the customers of mining, the purchasing house, they operate as a buyers group, working together to share their interest to have the opportunity to source more responsibly mined materials and produced materials. And what's really powerful right now is that you had many of them doing their own thing individually before. Maybe they were looking at greenhouse gas emissions and carbon counting and how does our supply chain add up to that. And that's important, but for the communities who've lived right around mining, that may not have been their biggest concern. They may have been wondering, is my water clean? Is that mine waste dam that's there? Is it safe? Am I going to be safe living downstream of it? And now, because you've got the end brands who buy mined materials, sometimes they buy direct, but oftentimes through a complicated supply chain, they are more aware now of a whole set of the issues around mining and their supply chain. And sometimes it's laws that have indeed even driven their awareness, due diligence laws, for example, right? So even though IRMA itself isn't a law, there are all these other laws that are around people's rights, indigenous rights, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Those laws have driven end brands to know more, to understand more, to map their supply chain. And increasingly now we have this exciting moment where the private sector end brands and the communities and indigenous rights holders where mining's happening are asking for the same thing. And this can then send a much clearer signal to the mining industry. Are you asking us to count carbon? Are you asking us to be responsive to community grievances? What do you need? The more they start to ask for the same thing, we send a clearer message in the industry to the market, what's there. So then the question is, what's in the standard, though, which you mentioned as well. I'm going to hop ahead of these for a moment because we'll come back to that, but I'm going to talk about what's in it. So
Mhm.
the IRMA standard has these four main groupings of chapters. So it's not like, let's talk about worker health and safety, but don't look over there at what's happening with pollution of water, or we're going to talk about greenhouse gas, but don't look over there at the impact to cultural heritage, for example, right? It's like, let's bring it all under one roof. We know mine sites aren't going to be perfect, especially many who have operated for a decade or 2 or 3 decades who are in place. They're going to have challenges, allow them to contextualize their challenge, but then create value for them to do better, to be improving over time. And what's in the IRMA standard wasn't just built up out of air. It itself, as you said, also drew on a whole set of either individual countries or international law reference points. So it was meant to create recognition for mining companies who are already following a whole bunch of existing regulations, whether it be in their country Or on an international level, maybe a management system, the company had said, okay, this country doesn't have, for example, water laws where mining is happening, but we can see other countries do. We're going to draw on that. I mean, that's part of what we're doing, is trying to say no matter where, whether the mining is happening in Nevada in the US or in Ontario, or it's happening in Zimbabwe or Chile, that people can know their drinking water will be protected, their cultural heritage will be protected, by creating sort of a common hum across what is expected of mining companies around the world. So that's really what you're looking at in terms of what's in the standard. It goes across those 25, 26 chapters. Um, Now, you said something as well about, oh, yeah, not certifying. I'm going to hop ahead here too, just for a moment, to say that when an audit is done of a mine in the IRMA system, it's not pass fail. And most standards are pass fail. Frankly, it's easier to do it that way. Either you meet it or you don't meet it. If you have a pass fail standard, one thing that can be nice and simple about that is you could put a green seal on something and say, check, yes, they do. But the problem is industrial scale mining has been far from the end consumer for a long time. And we didn't want to just set an octave above current practice, the standard. We really, to have the buy-in of all those people at the beginning, people wanted the freedom to talk about what is best practice, but not just say fail to all those who aren't at best practice right now. And frankly, the market hasn't really valued and created enough incentive for best practice now. So that's the work we're working to begin now, is really to create that value. So we give a score for each of the chapters. So if you were looking at a mining company's audit report of their mine site against the IRMA standard, first of all, it's public and it's free. So you have access, and it's translated into languages that where the mine site operates, as well as English. So then you can flip into it and you can look at not just an overall pass fail, because we don't do pass fail, we don't certify, we're just verifying where the performance is. And it's not only an overall score, but every chapter that I mentioned earlier there is scored. And then if you want to know, let's look at this site. This is interesting. This site has 25% score in legal compliance. I'd like to know more about that. You can open up then the legal compliance chapter and read each of the requirements in the legal compliance chapter and which ones did they meet or partially meet or not meet, and then what were the auditor's notes around that. So then you really have this robust sense of an ability. Now, not everybody wants to engage. They don't necessarily want that ability to engage at that level. But if you're a local community or NGO advocates supporting local communities, you indeed may want that, because it becomes a list that then you can look through. And if we look at the community around the Unki mine in Zimbabwe, which was the first one to do an IRMA audit back in 2019, their audit report was picked up by Zimbabwe Environmental Law Organization and who worked with a local community. And they said, okay, look, 25% of the potential for best practice here isn't yet being met. How do we talk to the mining company, Anglo American, about that? But they didn't take to Anglo American a list of 100 things that could be better that were in the audit report. They talked with the community about what's the short list that's most important to you. And so now you have the company Anglo American and local communities around there saying we are in a much more robust dialogue because we had this audit report, and the community feeling satisfied the issues that are most important to them are the ones the company has prioritized. It was a way to have that verified information by independent third-party auditors on how did they perform against it. Um, and maybe I'll pause there, but I'm going to hold that you mentioned something around benchmarking against different places' laws and stuff as well. But I'll just take a pause in case you want to chat on any of these.
Again, really fantastic. Prior to us having the conversation, I was saying, Aimee, we're just going to be going to and fro, and that's exactly what we're doing in exactly the right way, as far as I'm concerned. So there's a lot of points here. It's public and it's free. Well, can I just point out that that's not the way actually governments operate, right? I wish I could say that for any mine or any grocery store or any you name it, that I could actually just check and see, here's the inspector reports on food safety of this particular store on the corner of X and Y Street. I can't get that, right?
Mm,
And same thing with respect to industrial facilities, mines, and so on. So this is where I get back to the point of modeling. this is possible. This is possible. Now, mind you, it's possible at an incredible expense by,
Mm,
first of all, IRMA, in the sense of administratively pushing for this and then actually documenting it and making it available. But it's also incredibly hard for the companies involved and the other stakeholders involved to work all this stuff out. And I do think, and you can agree or disagree with me on that, it makes it so that even though I think the graded approach is absolutely fantastic because it does give, you can be here for now and recognize that you want to be here later on. And I think that's critically valuable, critically valuable. But I think a lot of mining companies are actually going to say, look, this is a absolute Cadillac of a
mm,
initiative, and we're not even close to that. And we don't particularly want to be exposed as not even close to that. So
mhm.
thank you, but no thank you, right?
Yep.
Um, so I mean, I think that's it's kind of the dilemma to
Mhm,
be to be this open, to be this transparent, is excellent for legitimacy and credibility, but I think you lose some potential participants by doing that. But at any rate, we'll talk about that further. Um, let's also talk about, we've both heard the expression, everybody's heard the expression, you don't want to see how sausage is being made, right? That expression, as far as I can tell, was originally made about law.
mm,
And boy, we're seeing exactly how sausage is being made in the United States right now. And I wish I didn't have to see it. It's that painful to see it now out on public, brazenly. Trump saying,
mhm.
no, I'm just going to tilt the scales here and here and here, and this way, for my interest, my personal interest, the interest of my friends. Whew, I'm not sure I want to see that, but we'll leave that aside. The that degree of exposure is very, very, I think, hard to take, even for good faith actors, in some cases. Um, if you take something like the Zimbabwe experience that you're talking about, you could have had an environmental organization in Zimbabwe who said, aha, only 25% compliance. We're running with that. We're running with
Mhm.
this is why the mine needs to be shut down. It is horrible.
Yeah.
Don't have to listen to us. Irma's just said 75% non. We're not talking about 25% compliance. We're talking about 75% non-compliance. Did
Sure.
you hear me? So,
Yeah.
so I think, you got a constructive approach from those environmental organizations, and I think from Anglo American, who I know has turned out to be a major partner in IRMA around the world. But you didn't have to. You didn't have to get that. You could have got this. I'm just going to weaponize this information
Mm,
in order to make them look bad and make me look good about, how I'm the shining, what is the expression, white
mhm.
knight in
Mhm.
armor and all that sort of stuff. So there's that. Now let's also talk about, speaking of law, FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. Technically
Mhm.
speaking, you know this and I know this, a declaration, a UN declaration is not a binding international law, the way, for example, an ILO treaty is when it is ratified and implemented. And there is a ILO treaty that specifically deals with free, prior, and informed consent, and it has been ratified and implemented in some countries in Latin America. Um, I don't know how well it's actually implemented, but at least they have ratified that. But FPIC is not, technically, it is not a binding
Mhm.
international law. However, it's quite possible for individual companies to say we are not going to do something unless we have free, prior, informed consent, and it is possible for IRMA to use it as you are. But I'm imagining that one of the hardest areas that you are finding with respect to implementation of IRMA as a whole is, and rightly so, it is the issue of indigenous communities and free, prior, and informed consent. And what do you do if you've got a community that says no? The answer is no.
Mhm.
We don't want the mine at all, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think the answer is the company says, Well, then we're walking away from that because we
Mhm.
cannot operate there. And IRMA says, well, then, that's going to be duly noted that there is not free, prior, and informed consent. And so you're never going to get above 25% in the rating or something like that. But do tell how
Okay.
you address that issue.
Okay. So I'm going to go through a few of these. I'm going to flow through them. You tell me if I miss any of them there. And I'm going to tuck consent and free prior informed consent right at the tail end of this, but I've made myself a little list so I don't lose the thread. Um, so the first is on the point of transparency and how do you get mining companies to come in. I mean, first of all, I'll say it is a brave act for all the reasons that you just said to come in. I mean, some mining companies will come in and just say, I'm willing to be audited. And sometimes they expect people to clap and appreciate, thank you for this. And sometimes they get a backlash of like, you think your best practice? Are you kidding me? Don't you know this problem and that problem? But the reality is, and one thing we'll say to them, I mean, mining companies will come and say that to us at times, like, are you kidding me? We just agreed to come in and do IRMA and our competition is not. And we're getting more criticism for agreeing to do this than our competition who's sitting silently over there. Where's your positive feedback loop here? But one thing we've said is, look, in this world today with your access to information, anyone who has a phone has transparency into the criticisms of your operation. Most of the ones who are concerned about like, we're not sure we want the world to know, dot, dot, dot. The world knows a lot of it already, right? Campaigning NGOs have been working very hard to raise the issues of industrial scale mining. But raising the issues alone does not solve the fact that there is a demand out there which is being fed by each of us for the products we use, and mining continues even as these harms go on. So part of what our work is to do is to say, like, step into more transparency, be honest about it. There will be a respect. It's not instant applause, but there is an appreciation, which is increasingly growing from unions, from NGOs, from civil society for the transparency of like, let's talk about how industrial scale mining is done. Let's talk about the impacts of it. And let's talk about what we could do to have less impacts and the value that we need the whole market to lean in and create to that. To that end, I'm going to back up here. So these are the 110 mining companies across diverse countries and materials coming in. Why? They're coming in because if I back up to that buyers group I gave you earlier, we can see about 90% of the mining companies agreeing to do an IRMA audit are doing so because their customers ask them to. So again, back to what you said again around, even if it's not legally required, in contracts and otherwise, you have customers who have either said, we're only going to keep a contract with you if you will do this audit because we need the information and we need to know what's happening there. And then we want to help you reduce harm in these places. We and brands don't want to be in conflict with local communities and Indigenous rights holders. So they're asking them to do it. And we're also finding the Rocky Mountain Institute, maybe Luke can help me in the chat, pop it in, but the Rocky Mountain Institute recently did a report on what is the financial cost of mining more responsibly. And they looked in particular, they interviewed companies doing IRMA audits and the IRMA standard and found that it's actually, it tends to be both a relatively low cost, 0.4% of their overall capital costs to lean in and do these things, in part because they're being asked to do them for a number of other purposes already, but also because they're reducing harm or reducing risk that also had expenses associated with them. So it's not this big financial outlay. And we've said basically that you're addressing your reputational risk and your conflict risk by stepping in. The other thing we've seen is that, as I mentioned about the scoring, and I know our site isn't near best practice, why would I be willing to do this? Is that across those chapters in the IRMA standard, we see that even though we've described best practices in all these 25 plus chapters, every single one of these chapters has at least one mining company at a given mine site that is already achieving more than 90%. So the IRMA standard isn't set at some, even though it's best practice, and even though a bunch of mining companies may not be reaching 90% in labor rights or in human rights, every single chapter has at least one company at a given site achieving. So we know it's doable. It's just that there has not been value created for most mining companies to achieve 90% in all the chapters. So maybe for whatever political or community reason, they really leaned into work health and safety and they're doing really well there, but not so much over here in water, right? Or maybe they really leaned into dealing with the dust problem they had, but they didn't really deal with this waste problem. And so that is part of our value to say it's doable. And how do we create a market, which is a market of reputation, a market of financial value, a market of political value for all of you to increasingly rise to that 90% or greater potential across the board so it's not so piecemeal of an operation. I just want to go back to this one as well, because it also speaks to the whole, like, maybe I won't do it. Right now, more than half of the world's lithium is already under audit in IRMA. Lithium is going into batteries that go into electric vehicles or energy storage. You already have almost a third of the world's nickel also under IRMA's audit by volume as well. So you don't really have mining companies saying, I won't do this, or that's just this NGO driven thing. Is you have now already in the 6 years since you and I last talked, Professor Webb, the shift in what the market was expecting of N brands and mining companies rising to that one. And you saw from that other slide, it's across diverse countries in the world as well. Um, I want to go back to free prior informed consent. I'm going to put this one up about the countries though. And apologies for making everyone dizzy by skirting through. Um, so free prior informed consent. So we do speak of this as this is sort of recognized globally now, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the rights that they have innately from their relationship and history on their lands. There are places in the IRMA standard. As I said, in most cases, what we're saying is you can always improve, but there are places where we say no-go things. So consent is one among them, but also dumping mine waste intentionally as a waste management plan into rivers, lakes, and the ocean. We say that is not best practice, and we will name that as not best practice. Or in protected areas at certain classifications and above, is there are certain places that we've set as protected areas. But so free prior informed consent on Indigenous lands is one we will also name. And you're right, that is a place where we do not have legal authority to come in and exert that, but we will name. And why would you want it to be named then? Well, because one thing we see over and over right now is that conflict does not create supply chains that work. So whether that be strikes or whether it be protests or whether it be litigation, um, we only have secure supply chains where we have community consent. And that will continue to increase as more of these materials are sought in places where we have both human conflict increasing and also in the increasing effects of climate change and emergencies around them, floods and fires and droughts and tensions around lands that are in healthy condition, drinking water, et cetera. If we're going to take lithium from the Atacama, if we're going to take nickel from Indonesia, an island archipelago with endemic biodiversity and indigenous people and fragile ocean ecosystems, we need to figure out how to do this without both harming our planet goals to live in a healthy home planet, but also we need to do it without increasing the conflict between the humans who are going to live together on this planet. And you've named at the top of this call multiple levels of conflict and conflict amongst governments and conflict amongst those who say we'll just invade other countries for their minerals. But it is a moment right now where we do not have to approach it by increasing conflict. This industry can bring a lot of prosperity. It offers jobs to community members who don't need college degrees to have them. It offers training. It comes in often with a whole set of its own management systems and rubric that it holds itself accountable to. But we need to brighten the spotlight on that and brighten the accountability and hold there so that we can have that place where you have Indigenous communities who would want to consent. Why do we assume that when someone has consent, they will automatically say no? You know, what is it about this industry that we think communities who are given the right to consent will automatically say no, so therefore we need to shove it upon them? Like, I don't think so. I think that this industry is talented enough and is bringing materials people want enough and an opportunity at prosperity that people will say yes if the context is right, right? If they're not giving up cultural heritage, if they're not giving up their clean water, and there is no reason why we need to have both of those things happen in order to have the materials that we're using for mining.
It's a complicated situation, and no one is sort of pretending otherwise. I am reminded of students in my class who get 60% and they're just shocked, and they'll say, "Well,
Mm,
may I introduce you to this student over here who got 95%?" So,
mm,
it's doable. I
mm.
think that's exactly your point. Actually, I do not say, "May I introduce you to," because that would be a
Just
breach of
say,
confidentiality.
neither
But
of
I'll
us
just
would sound
say,
popular there.
yes, I just say there are students in this class who got high marks, but there's that. So, second point is self-selection. I do
Mm,
imagine that the ones who come and knock on your door have already done a lot of research concerning what IRMA is, how IRMA works, and they are self-selecting to go through IRMA because they know
mm,
that this is what's going to happen. So the ones who say, screw that, we are just going to get this stuff out of the ground. We don't care about anybody along the way. It's just get in, get out. They're not going to be they're not even going to be applying for
mm.
IRMA, right? They've already indicated,
I would say it's more
forget it.
complicated than that now. I
Okay,
mean,
good.
we definitely thought, I mean, if you had asked me 10 years ago who will be coming, we definitely thought it would be the leaders who would come first because
Yeah.
they would want to say, look, we know that this other company here had a massive tailings dam failure, or we know this one destroyed cultural heritage. We're not going to do that to your community. We're going to be different. So that's who we thought was going to be our target audience. And for that reason, civil society and NGOs were actually most worried about greenwashing. Will you have
Mm.
companies who come and say, we got no problems, here we are,
Yeah,
give
yeah,
us our
yeah,
IRMA
yeah.
check. What has happened instead is that if you look across those countries and the materials and the companies, um, because 90% are coming in because their customers have told them they must, you have a whole set of companies who are associated by their end brands as having supply chain risk to them. And they said, um, we will not have a contract with you any longer unless you do this IRMA audit. So instead of seeing just the top and the best, or those who swaggered forward and said, we feel pretty comfortable, we can knock this out of the park, instead, you have a whole set where there was a risk seen or
Hmm, hmm.
perceived, and they stepped in. And for them, I think it's been a very interesting journey, maybe far more scary than for a company like Anglo American, who said, we'll bring our whole portfolio in. But you have companies who have really are making a journey from where they were to like, what does it mean to be in IRMA? So we have our first audit in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a cobalt site there, which has been in the news significantly over the last couple of years for air issues, worker issues. And then we have a site in Indonesia that's a nickel site. And we have these nickel sites that are right alongside the ocean. There are issues of siltation into fisheries and contamination of water and large industrial parks processing nickel. So these are not sites that would all say we feel like we're already at our best. They may be saying like we want to stay in the supply chains of preferred customers. And then you have governments paying attention to that. Back to your point on governments, then, which is saying, look, we notice the government of Indonesia, for example, noticing that some countries have been the places that buyers will say, we don't source from there. Right? That country has a lot of harm. We don't source from there. Well, Indonesia does not want to be that place that you do
One of
not, yet
those.
you say you
Hmm.
don't buy from, right? We're going to go
Yep.
buy nickel from Canada and the US instead, right?
Yeah.
Instead of there. Um, but a lot of the world's nickel is coming from Indonesia. It will continue to come from there, right? It comes from Russia as well as like, can we lean into these places where there are indigenous people and practices nowhere near best practice and be useful? And that's actually what's happening in practice.
Well, that is fantastic. That kind of domino effect is fantastic. And I would just say again, from just using a professor metaphor here, is that I've got some students who pick up their socks and do really well because their dad says, "I'm not going to give you this or that unless you do that," which is very much like uh, companies saying, "We're not going to buy from you unless you do
Mm,
this or that." There's nothing internal unfortunately, with those companies in the sense of them realizing this would be a better way of operating. They're just doing it because they're externally required. but they are changing their practices. And perhaps I see this also with some students who come to that category. They start off kicking and screaming. And by the end, they're saying, actually, this is really good. I'm really, learning a lot from this. So I'm sure that you've got kind of a similar dynamic
Mm.
going among some of your companies as well in terms of their motivations. But I've got couple of points. One is Carzol. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but it was a
Mm.
company which agreed to do a pilot, and it was not a large, multinational that's operating everywhere. They agreed to do a pilot with you, and I know that they stepped out of
Mhm.
the IRMA process. I don't know whether or not there's a story there, but I thought I'd give you an opportunity, if there was a story, for you to just expand on that. Did they just have
Um,
enough and feel
no,
they've
I mean,
taken
there's
a
not that much of a story, but actually, anytime that you have a company come in, there are only company who's come in and then stepped out. You're right. They were very early. I mean, this is a small,
Mexican incident? Yeah.
exactly, copper silver mixed metal mine in Mexico. Its journey in was unusual in that there were people in that part of Mexico who had been involved with the Forest Stewardship Council when it first started, who said, look, Carizal, you may be small, you may be, not the wealthiest or the biggest company out there, but you can distinguish yourselves for transparency, which they did. And if you watch some of those early uh, webinars and videos that we did on that one, they didn't only pilot, they were actually one alongside Anglo American. They were the first two to do an
Yeah.
audit, which was stunning because they were
Yeah.
such a small company. And they were very open in their journey. They were very open about the ways their site had problems. It was so refreshing because just the level of frankness, and their leadership turned over. And it's a reminder back again. I mean, you said
Mhm.
something about the sausage making of laws and stuff too. I mean, ultimately, how much of this work comes down to individual humans?
Yeah.
When Tiffany and Company came in, Mike Kowalski was their CEO at the time, and you had a visionary human who was willing to do something which was well outside his own narrow job description, right? And so you have humans sitting in places who are willing to step out of their narrowest definition of what they're there for, and also with both a sense of heart, but also the financial and market opportunity over the long haul. So I would love to see them come back in, but as they changed leadership there, they stepped out. And we said to them, we understand we remove you here. You'll see on our website where we say that they no longer have recognition in IRMA. And I hope they'll find that they have value coming back to that.
That's another great point, and that is the point of individual leadership, which is fantastic whenever you have that. Of course, you have the
Mhm.
reverse of that with someone like Trump.
Yeah.
So he's showing how much destruction one individual
Mhm.
can have. If the institutional structure around him or her is not strong enough to prevent him or her from doing bad. I mention that because I'm not a big fan of individuals doing amazing things, not
Mm.
because I have any trouble with them doing that, but because what there needs to be is the institutional structure around that so that that becomes not just what that person did, but rather now this is embedded in the DNA of the company or the
Yes.
country or whatever it is we're talking about. So that
Agreed.
the bad stuff doesn't happen again and the good stuff is locked in, and
Hmm.
that becomes the new floor. You
Hmm.
can't go below that. So I don't know if you have any comment on that, but
Yeah,
that's
I know. I agree with you. I mean, many wonderful things get done by wonderful people, but it's not systems-wide change unless we find a way to integrate it in, whether that's a policy, a system, a broader commitment. But I completely agree with what you said there. I mean, I think also it's why keeping doors open to relationships and connections being found.
yeah.
It's great to have places where you thought you may not have had alliances, but then you see because there's just so many reasons that there's value to do more responsible mining and it works for the industry. There's no reason for there to be this oppositional point on it right now.
Right. I really do want to get around to your thoughts on the viability of a global multi-stakeholder coalition in support
Mm,
of the rule of law. But
mm.
I also have got excellent sets of questions here from people patching in.
great.
and I'm going to give the floor to them now.
All
So I'm
right,
just going to
let's do
read
it.
them out. You can do
Okay,
triage in terms of
okay,
which ones you want to handle, but
I'm
they're all
ready.
good. And thank you, people patching in, for doing that. So here we go. I'm not naming names. That's it.
Okay.
Here we go. If Indigenous people unanimously refuse to give prior informed consent to a mining project, must the mining company cease and desist to be compliant with IRMA? If
Okay.
Indigenous people object to a project, but the government approves and supports the project, what must the mining company do to be compliant with IRMA? So what happens
Okay.
when government is not on the same page? As, for example, can a mining company and host country government opt out of the norm regarding Indigenous peoples for a particular mining project while remaining supportive of IRMA with respect to all other norms? That's just one excellent set of questions, and thank you so much.
Okay.
Here's another. Um, can you ask Aimee who WHO capitalized the independent auditors are? By which
Yes.
I mean, what are the qualifications, certifications of independent auditors? How does one become an IRMA auditor? So that's the second line of questioning. Here's another one. In practice, how do voluntary frameworks like the UNGC, UN Global Compact, compare with audited assurance systems such as IRMA?
Mm.
And in high-risk extractive contexts, what mechanisms are most effective in driving corporate behavior change? Uh, and sort of another number of them are listed off. Reputational pressure, third-party certification, reliability, and so on. So there's another question. Um, okay. Here's the question. The IRMA Ready standard, oh yeah, that's a good one. The IRMA Ready standard, we
Mm.
haven't talked about that. The IRMA Ready standard has been in draft and open for pilot testing since 2021.
It has.
What has piloting revealed about whether early stage exploration juniors with small teams and tight budgets can realistically meet audit based requirements? And has that changed how IRMA scales expectations across the 6 stages? So
Okay.
just some
Great
easy questions there.
questions.
Yeah, yeah.
These
I'm
are
sure
all
that's no
great
problem.
questions. Okay, so I will I'm going to take them apart and please, I'm going to also, please feel free to pop, I don't think I can do this, but if you can pop my email directly in here. And so anybody who has these questions,
Okay.
and if I'm sure I'm not going to answer them because each of them is worthy of a deeper conversation. So I'm happy to go deeper with anyone, but I'm going to skim through these. So the auditors, who are the auditors and how do you become one? So there are right now only 4 audit firms allowed to do IRMA audits. For a long time, it's only been 2, and now we just added 2 more. So one is SCS Global Services, and the other ERM CVS. Those 2 have done most of our audits to date. We started only with those 2 originally because we knew that the quality of how the standard was measured was just as important as what the standard itself said. And because we also knew we were doing something no one had done before. IRMA audits are required to be publicly noticed. Auditors must proactively go out and reach out to local people that the company has not given them as approved people. They meet with workers without management there. This is unprecedented level of transparency and engagement in the community, everything from auditor safety to community safety, to the company's comfort and understanding what are we doing with whom, why, ensuring there's not reprisals on local communities and workers. That's me taking a side deep dive down a rabbit hole just to say the reason why we started with only 2 is because we knew we were going to be learning as we went, and we needed firms who were willing to walk into that with us and who understood that IRMA's reputation and value to all 6 houses of governance was only going to be as good as the quality and competence of those audit firms. And it's been really hard work. So we started with those 2 who've done most. We recently added Resilience Environmental Services, which is based out of South Africa. And then we also added KPMG, and they have both just begun new audits as well. So I'm thrilled to see those 2 new firms taking in audits because the others honestly were getting quite busy. And so really thrilled to see all 4 of them out there in the world. They have done deep work to understand what is IRMA's expectations. So, and the mining company must pay them to do the audit, but their right to audit is conferred by IRMA. So if they, sometimes you have civil society concerned, our auditors, can they be trusted? Are they paid by the mining company? Are they being influenced? There's tremendous transparency in how conversations go between mining companies, their auditors, and IRMA, and we have rules on that. And if you wanted to see, there is a whole set of ISO requirements and auditing requirements, and then the ISEAL Alliance, which sets a code of conduct for global standard setters and auditing. You can go to our website, to responsiblemining.net, and you'll see what is required to become an IRMA audit firm. And if you are an audit firm asking this question, you can apply at any time. And we just go slowly through reviewing the audits there. Excuse me, the applications for auditors. Global compacts versus IRMA. This is a big question because, of course, there's many different global compacts and
Right.
other,
That's the UN Global Compact, the
yes,
10 principles.
and how these things, so what they're across the board, you have many which aren't actually audited, for one. You have some which are just meant to be like a guideline, and then people are basically self-assessing, self-initiating. The UN Sustainable Development Goals were much like that. And then we have a report on our website too. If you're trying to meet the SDGs, here's how the IRMA standard helps you meet each of these sustainable development goals, for example. So what we're trying to do is we're very much going to a mine site, and so it's not, you won't see a company being able to say our company-wide score is, for example, Anglo American has had to go site by site by site by site. You have the French company IRMA saying we will do all our sites against the IRMA standard. They started in Senegal, but they're saying, okay, now their site in Indonesia, they will also do. So they must go site by site, which we see is where the impacts are and where
Yeah.
communities and workers experience them, and then verifying on the ground. But in as many places as possible where we can integrate the expectations of the UN compacts or others, like OECD due diligence, etc., ILO conventions on either indigenous rights or worker health and safety. We've worked to build those into the IRMA standards, so then we can be actually verifying what they asked for, which may not have had an auditing component to it.
That's an incredible amount of intellectual work to kind of align all of those. And I must say, there's kind of a hierarchy in the sense of if you've got things that are at the principles level, which is what the UN Global Compact is, then you can just ensure that those principles are infused in the much more detailed
Mhm.
stuff that you have following. Same thing with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, and so on and so forth. They can be infused in the very detailed requirements that you have, and you can refer to them, right? You
That's
do
right.
refer to them as the case might be,
Hmm.
right? As the case,
Yes.
yeah,
I love that, in fact, you use the word detailed there too, Professor Webb, because a common critique of IRMA years back more often was that IRMA is so prescriptive. Like it uses so many words, it's so detailed, it's so long. And what we said is, well, it's not prescriptive. It is descriptive. We describe what we're looking for. We use a lot of the detail because you might have a standard which says a mining company should have a stakeholder engagement plan, and auditors are going to come out. But the mining companies themselves often are like, can you tell me what exactly are you looking for there?
right, right,
Because it could be, are you looking for this 50-page document on how we work with local people and how often we meet? And are you looking for minutes of the meetings and who went and all this? Or are you just looking for like the post-it note that has 3 names we plan to meet with someday, and that's our plan? And
yeah,
so we have a lot of detail. Mining companies are never the ones who are saying it's too detailed. Like they open the document and
yeah.
the
They
guidance
want the
document, and
detail,
they're like, before you guys come out, we want to know what you're looking for.
yeah,
And that also loops back to something you said earlier. For those who have worked with it longer, we have a self-assessment tool, which we give to companies free. They must use it before they bring auditors out anyway. So they fill in and audit themselves. And because we're not here foremost to score, we're here to drive value for them to do better. We want them to say, oof, we're only going to get 32% in the water chapter. But if we've just tinkered with the tool and we see if we change this and this and this, we're going to get higher score. So let's go out on the ground and look at how we're monitoring right now, how we're managing these leaks we've had, et cetera. We want them to find the places they can do better. Um, so IRMA ready. So this is about the IRMA standard right now. We are measuring just mines that exist on the planet that are producing materials we use. later this year, the second version of the IRMA standard, which is indeed, your questioner is right. It has taken us years. It took us something like, what was it? It was 12 years to get IRMA version 1.0 out in the world and have that shared agreement on a shared definition of what's responsible mining. And it has now been a conversation of over almost 5 years of where do we need to increase and move to 2.0? What does 2.0 look like? We've learned from audits, and we learned from, places where things weren't clear, gaps, greenhouse gas emissions issues have moved on. The world moved on gender. So we have places where we've fallen behind. And the new standard will also apply to exploration development. So the future of mining. And so there is a tool that when you open version 2.0, you can put into it, where are you at in the
Right.
exploration? Because of course there's such a spectrum of
Sure.
pre-feasibility to like almost constructing but not yet producing, so that you can pull out the subset of requirements that fit there with the opportunity to help influence the mines of tomorrow so that you can create value. And those companies are very excited most of the time to come in, even more so than the existing mines, because one, they have an opportunity to change the operations before they're operating, and because they have tremendous interest in access to capital. Until they're producing, they don't have something to sell other than an idea, and they want to reassure the investment community, who is increasingly investing in mining, but also sees mining as being very risky. They want to say, look, we're not going to be risky. We're not going to be the legacy problems you've seen before. We're going to do this in a foundationally different way. And we're searching to give them a tool
Yeah.
where they can do that and reassure that. I think if I give you the very shortest, this is a very disrespectful issue to give a short answer on, but if I want to, it's so important. On the question around Indigenous rights, the IRMA standard, and you'll see this even more in the new 2.0 coming out, but it says a set of, if you open the chapter specifically, free prior informed consent, it's chapter 2.2, and you can look even just at that one chapter. It basically lays out, if you're a new mine, do you do these things? If you are a long existing mine, do you do these things? Whether or not you have achieved consent, which is not consensus, first of all, also, but if you have the consent through the Indigenous people of that region's own governing authority, do you have their consent? If you do not, then there's still multiple other requirements where you can show what are you doing to work toward consent? What are you working toward for a healthy relationship with this community and move to more increasingly positive engagement? And we do recognize Indigenous people even where governments have not done recognition. So there are entire nations of the world who either do not recognize Indigenous people at all, or where recognition has not happened yet. It's in progress for other people, but the auditors are talking to people who are identified as Indigenous within their own self-definition and against the UN declaration. And so it's documenting a dynamic and ongoing relationship. So even for those who can demonstrate they have consent, it's not a given that will remain. And so it will be a dynamic review as well.
Would you be willing to take one issue? Maybe it would be the Indigenous issue. Have another session on that where we could just kind of deep dive on that alone. Because I hate
Oh.
to give short shrift. I hate to give short shrift to you in terms of your explanation. It doesn't have to be that one. We can choose one. And I'm not saying next week, Aimee.
Yes,
I'm just saying
let's
at
do
some
that.
point.
Let's do that.
Okay.
If we do the focus around IRMA standard and Indigenous rights, it would be great. We can bring on First Nations leaders as well who are working on this issue and who
Perfect.
know the IRMA standard
Perfect.
well as well, and those looking
Okay.
at it on the global level. But any set of these issues would be really fun to talk
Yeah,
more with
good.
you and your listeners on it.
Okay. Now, there's no time left, but I'm going to ask you now anyway. Going back to what we're seeing now is really the corrosion and the deterioration of the international rules-based order, right?
Mm, mhm.
It's actually an intentional campaign to undermine uh, international, intergovernmental uh, apparatuses and processes and the rule of law itself. And that led me and others that I've been working with to say, what we need to have is a multi-stakeholder coalition in support of the rule of law. And we thought it would be fairly easy to get that because if you took a look at if you took a look at a multinational corporation, if you took a look at a multinational NGO, if you took a look at a government, surely what the one thing they could all say is, well, we cannot operate without the rule of law. The rule of law
Mm,
is the thing. The trust created when there is a rule of law is what everything that we do is driven on. So I thought it would be a slam dunk,
mm,
and it has not been a slam dunk, and I'm not getting
mm,
it. I'm not getting it,
mm,
and it's I'm passing it your way because, you know, we basically recognize that everything that IRMA does is on a law basis, on a rule of law basis. Even when
mhm,
the law is not working all that well, still law is the basis upon which everything else flows. So I
mm,
thought, for example, we would be able to get IRMA to just put a statement on the website saying, we support the rules-based international order and the rule of law, and we support any multi-stakeholder coalition that supports that. I would have thought that would be a slam dunk. Um, and I'm not saying particularly IRMA has to
mm,
do that, but what would be your thoughts about the value of there being such a coalition? Obviously, like
mm,
IRMA, the coalition is just the first step, right? To be clear, but it seems like such a basic and important point for the United States to hear, for
mm.
Trump to hear that the world says we have to have this. Don't do that. But it wouldn't be directed at Trump. They just say, anywhere, everywhere,
Mhm.
we support the rule of law. So,
Wow. Okay, first of all, I am going to answer a question for which I am not qualified to answer. I'm outing myself to the entire group here because I think, Professor Webb, you are asking me your 301 PhD question. I am not worthy, but I'm going to answer it to the best of my ability anyway, with at risk of being that student with the 64 who you compare to those with a 95.
there is no foolish question. This is what I always say.
No, I'm going to step into a foolish answer instead. What I'm going to say is here, I think there is a lot of confusion in this globe right now and fear. I think there are people are afraid of lots of different things, and I think they're afraid of coming out with big statements and big claims where they don't necessarily know what the repercussions of speaking up will be, whether they're
Mhm.
inside a corporation or they're in a local community. I think there's a lot of fear right now of who is making decisions and then a feeling of being I'm going to be, even if I'm a bold and visionary person who wants to change the world, I'm going to be quite judicious about which places I sign my name to what end and is it going to have a meaningful impact. So I think even if I take this and I make it very personal, not to your situation but
Yeah,
to
yeah.
Irma's, when we sat down to say will people sit at a table to talk about responsible mining, and there was a lot of skepticism, we couldn't do it right just from there. Like people wouldn't have signed up to that either because they would have said, oh, this is probably a greenwashing thing, or these are these NGOs who are anti-mining and they're never going to be happy and they're just going to campaign against us and this is going to be a waste of time. And am I going to be criticized for even sitting with them on either side of the table? I mean, we needed to start with we have a set of 10 principles of engagement. Why do we sit together? And I think that can help a lot to creating it says things like we will agree that we're going to talk about best practices, but that minds at any level can come in and show improvement over time. I mean, that took many hours of conversation, that one
Right,
sentence, right?
right.
We're going to deal with respect, but we may not always disagree, and our disagreements may be aired in public. I mean, that took a lot of conversation, right? It doesn't say we agree, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
doesn't say we're not. I mean, we have had moments where there have been some organizations who participate on our board of directors litigating against others who are there, and yet they step to the IRMA table in respect to one another as they sit down and talk about this place of trying to create value for this. So I think the more you can take a lofty intention statement and get to some principles of what it will stand for, and then what you hope and believe you can actually change with it. Because I think people feel that they're putting themselves out in risk. And you started our conversation also about talking about coalitions versus initiatives and then movements. And I think
Mm,
if I can loop back to you at the beginning on that, it made me think about our own effort and about how much we may have started as a coalition and moved to initiative, but we often are having to go back to being a coalition again and just remind ourselves, why are we sitting here together?
yeah,
And what does it mean to get along?
yeah.
And just like we talked about with free prior informed consent, it's not a one-time agreement, and you have
Yeah.
to keep coming back to it as people change and as what they're agreeing to might change. So,
Terrific. Yeah, that is
Mm.
a nuanced answer, which is exactly what it deserves. And I think coming out of that, what I'm thinking is that there needs to be a statement underneath just we support the rule of
Mm.
law, and it has to be a statement which acknowledges this kind of the operating reality type of thing. But I mean, basically the reason why companies are not standing up and saying much is that they don't want to have their head chopped off,
Mm.
right? They don't
Mm.
want to have the 30% of Trump supporters who happen to be in very important positions in government and otherwise chopping their heads off for sticking their head up on a particular
Mm.
issue. And they're not, it's not just governments that way, NGOs as well. So anyway, suffice to say, that's going to be something I'm going to keep on working on. And your thoughts on that, just off the top of your head, were really terrific and
Mm.
totally fair, totally fair.
Mm.
So, I mean, there's so much more I want to talk about here now, but we've agreed we'll have a follow-up session. We'll dig deep on,
Mm.
excuse the pun, on one of these areas. After doing a, open pit mine version, now we're going to do a shaft version on a particular topic. Again, to use a bad metaphor here,
Mm.
but we'll dig up all the
Mhm.
details.
Okay.
So we'll
High
do
grade that
that.
top topics. That's right. Mm.
Exactly. All right.
Right.
But in the meantime, Aimee, on behalf of Toronto Metropolitan University as a whole, and specifically the CSR Institute and all of our listeners, thank you so much for superb insights. Really, really appreciate it. And we will be talking again. And Luke, again, thanks to you
Thank you,
for
Luke.
stepping in, providing information here and there. Much appreciated.
That's great.
Thanks.
Thanks all. Thank you
All the
so
best.
much. Take care now.